What is post-activation potentiation? Post-activation potentiation, or PAP, is a transient increase in performance following a preload stimulus. So what does that mean? It means that when you do a heavy resistance training exercise or a preload stimulus, and then follow that with a power exercise, you will see a temporary increase in performance. Post-activation potentiation is typically used to develop strength and power, as well as to prime the nervous system before competition. It is the mechanism behind contrast training or complex training, otherwise known as the French contrast method. And like I alluded to earlier, it is when you do a heavy resistance exercise and follow that with a power exercise. So a back squat followed by a vertical jump. So how does post-activation potentiation occur? Currently, there's no conclusive evidence for the physiology of PAP. Although we don't know exactly how PAP occurs, what we do know is that muscle fibers will respond based on their contractile history. Some of the proposed mechanisms are Henneman's size principle, which states that we recruit the smallest motor units and then gradually increase until we get to the biggest, strongest motor units. The bigger motor units tend to be the type 2 or the really quick and explosive motor units, and they also have the highest threshold before you can activate them. By performing the heavy resistance training exercise first, we can lower that threshold so that the explosive exercise we can recruit the type 2 really big motor units at a quicker rate. We have an increased sensitivity of the myofibrils to calcium, which makes it easier for those muscle fibers to contract. We have an increased spinal cord synaptic excitation, which basically means we have an increased neuromuscular efficiency. And then we have a temporary change in pronation angle. And pronation angle is the angle in which the muscle fibers kind of align with the tendon to tendon axis. So what are the benefits of post-activation potentiation? We have an increased neuromuscular efficiency, strength, peak power, peak force, jump height, impulse, peak torque, and rate of force development. We do have some things to consider. The first thing we want to consider is athlete individuality. Different athletes will respond differently to post-activation potentiation. You'll have hyper-responders and non-responders, and then people that fall in the middle as well. So it's important to remember that different athletes will respond differently. Next thing we want to consider is training age. This is an advanced training method and is not something we want to just throw at beginners right away. It has been shown in the literature that PAP tends to favor those with a higher training age. Next, we want to consider muscle fiber type. PAP tends to have more of an effect with athletes that have a higher percentage of type 2 muscle fibers. So this would primarily be like sprinters, throwers, athletes that have a lot of speed and power, whereas maybe not a long distance runner. We also want to consider the desired potentiation effect, or movement specificity. PAP will have a localized improvement and a non-localized reduction. So what does this mean? If we were going to try to potentiate a sprint, we wouldn't do the preload stimulus as a bench press. But we may use the bench press if we're going to preload like a throw or a shot put perhaps. So when we are choosing a preload stimulus, we want to choose something that utilizes the same muscles and the same movement pattern as our desired potentiated effect. We also want to consider the volume and the load of the preload stimulus. We do not want to have something that is too fatiguing that will actually hinder performance later. Two of the studies I was actually reading recently both looked at squat and bench press as the preload stimulus in terms of a vertical jump. To be expected, the squat in both studies was a good preload stimulus for the vertical jump, but the bench press actually hindered the performance in both studies. So what does this mean? That means that we want to have a preload stimulus that's as specific as possible to the desired effect. However, post-activation potentiation may be limb specific, but not hyper-specific. For example, one study used the deadlift as a preload stimulus for sprint and jump performance in American football players, and they found that deadlifts were able to improve the sprint and jump performance of those football players. Other studies have found that squats are also an effective preload stimulus for sprint performance. There is some argument out there surrounding sleds as a potentiation effect. Sled pushes and pulls are very effective for potentiating a sprint performance. However, no literature that I've seen compares the potentiating effect of sleds to squats or deadlifts. So, free research idea if anyone wants it. Another important thing to consider is the fatigue to potentiation ratio. Post-activation potentiation is time dependent. Fatigue dissipates at a quicker rate than the potentiation effect. Our goal is to find the optimal time window where fatigue is minimal, but potentiation is still maximized. On average, this is 3 to 10 minutes. After 3 minutes, the fatigue will have dissipated, and then you'll have from 3 to 10 minutes to utilize the potentiated effect. It is important that our volume and load of the preload stimulus is not too much that it induces too much fatigue. One study I looked at used sled pushes with 75% body weight and 125% body weight, and they found that the 75% body weight group actually improved with their sprint performance, whereas the 125% body weight group was impaired. This is most likely because the 125% body weight group actually had too much fatigue and was unable to perform maximally after that. It is also important to note that the optimal time window may differ between exercises. For example, one study I looked at was analyzing different exercises and the potentiation effect, and they found that the optimal time window was 4 to 12 minutes for the back squat, 3 to 16 minutes for the bench press, 7 minutes for the power clean, and 90 seconds when using accommodating resistance. Examples of accommodating resistance are bands and chains, things that kind of change weight as you go. For example, if you're doing a bench press and you're pushing a band, it'll be really tight at the top, but maybe a little bit looser at the bottom. With traditional exercises, the potentiation effect for the study was 87 to 93% of 1 rep max, whereas the accommodating resistance was a little bit lighter, 77 to 81% 1 rep max. This study looked at the effect of back squat and power cleans and sprint and jump performance and bench press on throw performance. They found that heavy back squats were the most beneficial to plyometrics or vertical jumps, whereas the cleans had the most carryover to sprinting. Another interesting point about this article was that they compared a 7-second isometric bench press, a 3 rep max bench press, a 3 rep max concentric bench press, and a 3 rep max eccentric bench press, and found that the isometric was the only one that induced a post-activation potentiation effect. So how do you use post-activation potentiation? We could do a maximum voluntary isometric contraction, such as like a rack pull. We could do eccentric overload with something such as weight releasers with a squat or bench press. We could do a traditional exercise. With a traditional exercise, it will have to be at least 85% of your 1 rep max, although some literature out there has shown that you can use as low as 60% to induce post-activation potentiation. One kind of key note about the low end of that 60% 1 rep max is intentionality. Intentionality plays a really large role, and when you're using a lighter weight, we want to be very intentional and perform the concentric portion of the movement as quickly as possible. We can use post-activation potentiation during our normal training, such as like a superset that we're doing throughout the workout, or we can do it as a warm-up. One note for the warm-up, before competition we want to be as unfatigued as possible. So we want to use very low volume here and very high load. So maybe 3 reps or less with like 85% or more. Post-activation potentiation causes a greater training stimulus. So if we use this in our training, we'll be able to get more training adaptations, including strength and power. And that's something most coaches will want. We can also use it as a warm-up when time is cut short, although it may not always be practical, whether in the warm-up or during our normal training session, to wait 3 to 10 minutes before we do the next set. And for field sports, it may not be practical to bring the weights all the way down to the field. If you're interested in learning more, send me a DM and I'll send you the complete list of references I used for this video. Thanks for watching.